Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today, we will look at two specific constructions in sentences. These play a significant role in making of a sentence. These two constructions are compound verbs constructions and the role of negation in the phrase structure. Together, at least in the case of negation, we can say this falls under the category of dependencies in natural languages. We will look at why we say dependencies when it comes to the interpretations of negation and elements depending upon presence or absence of negation. So far, we have looked at displacement and a particular level of representation of elements in phrase structure at what we say deep structure. We have looked at how elements like anaphors, or expressions and pronominals get interpretations in a sentence and the role of phrase structure for such interpretations. We have seen how structural relations which come out of the understanding of phrase structure helps us dealing with cases and how they help us understand hierarchical relationship between elements in a given sentence. Continuing with that, we are looking at two specific constructions. Compound verb constructions are specific to South Asian languages, and then we will look at negation as well. Compound verbs will help us understand phrase structure in a specific way that there are elements in natural languages which have several components but they form one category, and we will look at these things in little bit details today. Let's start with compound verbs. There are two types of compound verbs in natural languages, in the languages where compound verbs are found. First type is a V plus V construction, where we have two verbs coming together and giving us one construction with one specific interpretation and meaning. In such a construction, both the parts are verbs. Look at the screen and then you can see examples like aa jao, baith jao, kha lo, padh do and padh lo. These are the examples from Hindi, one of the major Indo-Aryan languages, and their English meaning is given next to them. The verb aa jao has two verbs in it, one ana and the other jana. Similarly, baith jao has two of them, baithna and jana. Kha lo has got two of them, khana and lena. Padh do has got two of them, padhna and dena, and baith lo is baithna and lena. Please pay attention to this construction. The meaning of this compound verb comes out of the combination of the two, and we get the meaning what is given next to these verbs. Now, having said that both the elements are verbs, it's important to pay attention to them. But let's move and look at the second type, and then we come back to this type once again. The second type of compound verbs are a type where the first element is either a noun or an adjective, and then the second part is verb, and together they make one single verb. Examples like काम करो, बात करो, साफ करो, So in the example काम करो, you see काम as a nominal element and karna as a verbal element, and together it gives us the meaning of work. बात करो has baat as a nominal element and karna as the verbal element and means to talk. Saaf karo has got saaf as an adjective and karna as a verb, and then we get clean. Now in the literature there are different terms for these types of constructions. One of the popular term for this type of construction is conjunct verb. But for the simplicity of our understanding, we are putting these two types that you have seen so far together under the same term compound verb, because we simply mean that the verb that we get out of combination of two elements, where in the first type we have verb and verb, and in the second type we could have either a noun and a verb and adjective and a verb. So these are the examples from Hindi, and you see their description and how they mean what they mean. Now when we look at the structure of these verbs, we find several interesting things, and that is significant for us to pay attention to, and particularly when these things are underlying deep down and we figure out these patterns again effortlessly. The first thing that we find is not all the verbs can be both V1 and V2 in a sequence of compound verb. What we mean by this is there is a serious restriction on the combination of the two. There is no such rule that we can derive by looking at the set of data. However, it's pretty simple to generalize and to say that not all the verbs, that is not any verb possible in Hindi or in languages where compound verbs are possible, can be in the place of V1, and any of these verbs can take place of V2. That's not allowed. What it means is only certain number of verbs are allowed to come together and form the combination what we call compound verbs. Why? We don't know much about it. And to know more about this, you need to look at literature available in the field. What we also find that more verbs can come as V1 and only a few can come as V2. So we see not all verbs can be V1 and V2 both in a sequence of a compound verb. The other restriction that we find on the construction of compound verbs is not more verbs can come as V1 and only a few verbs can come as V2. That is, the total number of verbs available in the inventory of verbs in a language like Hindi, only a handful of them can be in the place of V2 in a construction of compound verb, whereas more verbs can come as V1. The total number of verbs that have been found in literature that can come in V2 is not more than 22 to 30. The next interesting thing that we find in such a construction is the meaning comes from V1, and the V2 only adds a shade to the total meaning. Now, this requires your specific attention, which we want to see carefully. What we are trying to say that in a construction like aa jao, what we find is the meaning of the total compound comes from V1, that is ana. So the total meaning of the verb is come, and the V2, which is jao, adds only some shade to this meaning, and I'll describe what I mean by that shade in a moment. But please look at this example. It's an interesting example where there are two verbs from a language like Hindi. Two of them have got completely opposite meaning. Ana means to come and jana means to go. Whereas when they are put together and when they form a compound verb, the meaning is coming from the first one, which is come. Now, it applies to all verbs of this type, where you can see in the verb baith jao, the meaning comes from the first one, baithna. In khalo, the meaning comes from the first one, khana. In padh do, the meaning comes from the first one, padhna. Then the question is, what kind of shade do the second verbs add to the total construction? Now, this shade is very subtle in its presence. The difference between two constructions like ana, like ao and ajao, baitho and baithjao is minimal. However, the distinction exists. If you ask speakers of this language to give you the distinction between the two, the best they can give is they will agree with you that there is a distinction, but it's hard to put the finger on the distinction between the two, that is baitho and baithjao. However, when you look at the larger set of data, it becomes little easier later when you have in the construction both the verbs as transitive, like khalo. In this construction, both are transitive verbs, that is khana and lena. Now, if you look harder and then see, also because of the intended meaning of the first verb, that is V1, we see this means eat. But the benefit of eating is intended towards the person who eats, and therefore a combination like kha do is not possible. Whereas we can have a combination like padh do, meaning read it for me, where the benefit of reading is directed towards the person who makes the request to read, as opposed to the construction like padh lo, where the meaning of the compound padh lo is directed towards the person who is going to read the thing that is supposed to be read. So, looking at the two contrastive sequence of padh lo and padh do, we can say the verb lena and dena are adding shades which are easier to see. Probably this happens because of the transitive nature of V2. Similarly, in the construction baithlo, it is easy to see the shade that comes from the meaning of the verb lena, that is, instead of saying baitho, when someone says baithlo, it is probably intended to mean that you need some rest, and if you do it, you will feel better. And therefore, a combination of baith do is not possible. Therefore, so we can talk about these things, but it's hard to come up with a rule which puts these kinds of constraints on what is possible and what is not possible. But as a general constraint on this construction, what we can say that the meaning of the compound comes from V1 and V2 only adds some shade to the total meaning of the compound. And we also see another significant thing in the construction of compound verbs, and particularly when they are used in a sentence, that it is V2 that carries all inflections. All the examples that you have seen so far are examples of imperative verbs, where you see imperative markers like jao, lo, do. These are the imperative forms of the verbs. So we do not see any change in the V1. The V1 comes as the stem, only with the stem after removing the infinitive marker, whereas the V2 carries all inflections, in these cases imperative markers. And finally, we see that in the phrase structure of V1 and V2 both appear as V. So the whole, when you look at this thing in terms of the structure of the phrase, which is VP, you are going to see both coming as under one VP. And then you will see that the theory requires some sort of manipulation to accommodate both the verbs. But both are part of the same VP, which predicts that this is one compound, one entity. This is interesting for us to see for the complexity of the structure and how it gets interpreted in terms of its meaning. And here we see the role of human mind in looking at the constraints that you have seen on the screen so far in a very clearer way. Even though it is difficult to put the finger on the distinction of meaning between the two that we have just discussed, like bato and batlo, or for that matter even more complex ones like ao and ajao. But it's very easy to see that there exists the distinction between the two. This is the most complex example that one can talk about, where human mind figures out these things effortlessly. However, in a real conscious effort in trying to study a structure of a sentence, it's very difficult to find which part and what rule of grammar helps us construct these constructions and get the intended meaning. The next part of this type of these types of constructions that we want to look at is in terms of dependencies, and we are going to look at some elements of negation and elements that depend on negation in a sentence for their interpretations. Very briefly, what is negation? There are three types of negation in a language like Hindi. We can say sentences like, if we have an affirmative sentence like John pizza khata hai, we can say a negative counterpart of this, John pizza nahi khata hai, where we can see the element nahi comes right around the verb. And I'm going to show you some examples of these things. And then we will evaluate what we mean by elements that depend on negations for their interpretations. And such elements are called negative polarity items in natural language. We will take examples from Hindi to look at these constructions. To understand negative polarity items are the constituents in natural languages that are sensitive to the presence and absence of negative licensors. In simple words, it simply means for a negative polarity item to be present in a sentence, it essentially requires the presence of a negation element as well. So let's look at some examples. So here are two sentences from Hindi, and the sentence is Rajiv hargiz nahi bolega, means Rajiv will not speak at all. Look at the constituents of this sentence. Rajiv is the subject of the sentence and rest of it is predicate, where the verb is bolega, which carries agreement markers and future tense on it. Specifically, I want to draw your attention to the negative element. The negative element is nahi in Hindi, And as you see, it occurs right before the verb, that is on the left of the verb. It is a verb final language and it occurs right before the verb to the left of the verb. Then we see that it is because of this element negation we can see the presence of the word Hargiz in this sentence is dependent on the presence of negative element nahi. If we do not have the negative element in this sentence, then this sentence is going to be ungrammatical. So you will not find Hindi speakers saying Rajiv Hargiz bolega. So with the examples of these two, you see two things. One, you are being introduced to negative elements in sentences or a particular type of sentence which are negative sentences, and then at the same time you see some elements in sentences which are crucially dependent on the presence of negation, and these are the elements that are called negative polarity items. So Hargiz in a language Hindi is a negative polarity item, and because the negation element is not present in sentence 2, therefore it is ungrammatical. The star in front of sentence 2 indicates ungrammaticality of this sentence. In second one, in the second set of sentences in 3 and 4, again you see मैंने कुछ भी नहीं खाया. This is a Hindi sentence, मैंने कुछ भी नहीं खाया. It means I did not eat anything. Look at the meaning of this sentence in English and see the meaning of this element kuch bhi as anything is dependent on the presence of negative element nahi. In the absence of this element, this sentence does not have same interpretation. Look at number 4. If we give it the interpretation of a question sentence, then it means did I eat anything? मैंने कुछ भी खाया? Then it means did I eat anything? However, if we put it as a general declarative sentence, मैंने कुछ भी खाया, it means I ate something. The point is the interpretation of kuch bhi as anything is dependent on the presence of the element nahi, that is a negation element in the sentence. Now, you have seen these 4 examples so far to see that there are some elements in natural languages which crucially depend for their presence and in some cases for their interpretations as negative polarity items on negative elements themselves. How we look at these things is also significant. Look at a familiar structure that you have seen before. This structure helps you understand a very simple sentence like John likes pizza. We have seen this sentence several times before. Now, the argument here is, with lot of evidence from literature, it has been suggested that though nahi looks like a lexical item, but it is present in the functional domain. So look at the corner where you see neg p. It is, when you look at the corner at neg p, you see it is maintaining the integrity of a phrase, and it is called a negative phrase which will have its spec, that is a specifier, and intermediate category neg p, and then it is going to head negation. In the head of the phrase is going to be negation, and then it will have its own complement. The argument is this phrase occurs in the functional domain, that is above the red line where you see agreement phrase, where you see tense phrase and aspect phrase, etc. A specific suggestion has been made that neg phrase will occur above TP but below aspect phrase. Now, those technical details are significant for details of the study of this theoretical construction and the theoretical developments of this particular structure. For our reference, it is simple thing that we need to understand that neg P is part of the functional domain, which is above this red line that you see on the screen, and then below, because below the red line what we have is the lexical domain. Now, this needs to be in the functional domain because it is from the functional domain that it can guarantee the interpretation of elements that are dependent on them. That is, from the functional domain it can dominate all other positions in the lexical domain, and therefore the relationship between the negation element in the functional domain and the lexical elements that are dependent on it for their interpretations, like negative polarity items, can be licensed and guaranteed, and their grammaticalities can be explained. Thank you.